Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Glad to have with us this morning live on the phone, Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Well, thanks for having me, as usual.
I wanted to start out talking about something I noticed on Congressman Tom Reed's Facebook page. I go to Reed's Facebook page, Gillibrand, Schumer's, to check out, see if there's anything that is newsworthy that's not on their websites or in their emails that they send out for news. Reed put up a thank you note to an Alfred University political science major. She's a junior. She just finished up her internship, they say, with Reed's office down in Washington. And the girl said the internship, gave her a lot of insights, and she'll use it when she graduates next year, and she hopes to get into politics and so on and so forth. What I wanted to, it was a standard thank you note and a standard thank you from the intern. What I wanted to bring up, Dr. Ostrower, was the whole trolling thing that was inspired by this thank you note online. And both sides do this. I've seen this happen to Gillibrand and Schumer, too, so it's not specific to Democrats, but all these people started trolling. That means you change the subject and post a negative comment, and they started going off on Reed or Trump or whoever. And I just thought to myself, why would you say that? And it occurred to me, both sides do this, and a lot of people do it a lot. Why is there no shame of this? Why do people think that every little comment that they want to make is so important? Is that because of the rise of digital media, Facebook, Twitter, and so on?
I think it has a lot to do with that, which is a way of saying that there's opportunity to do it. I think it's also related to the fact that American politics has become much more polarized than it had before, and when I say polarized, it becomes much more angry than it had before, and angry people are likely to express their anger. We see it on both sides. Some of it is a lot worse than what you're talking about. Some of it has to do with the fact, for instance, that Representative Maxine Waters has received credible death threats, forcing her to cancel appearances fairly recently. There was a Tennessee congresswoman, a Republican, who also had to cancel an appearance as a result of threats against her. So, there's that anger out there, the ability to express it via social media, and not only to express it, but to express it anonymously, so that one doesn't have to, in a sense, place oneself at risk by making these sorts of dumb comments. But it's a fact of life, and I don't think that's going to go away unless we all say collectively, which we're not going to do. If we all say collectively, hey, we are simply going to be a little bit more civil. We're going to be a little bit less tied to not just social media, but to the opportunity to make comments in respect to public announcements. It's a fact of life, and we're going to have to live with that.
We're talking with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. One of the things I always like to do when Dr. Ostrower is on is go to the historychannel.com website and check out This Day in History. Now, Dr. Ostrower had mentioned he'd like to bring up Adams and Jefferson on today's show. We will get to that. The big thing that they're saying in today's This Day in History, as far as modern history goes, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa, the Union leader, disappeared, vanishing, and there's been all sorts of theories as to what happened to him and who was responsible. Taking us, that was in This Day in History, July 31st, 1975. Going back to the 1960s, there was a lot of back and forth in congressional hearings between Jimmy Hoffa and then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. What were all those about, Dr. Ostrower, those hearings between RFK Sr. and Jimmy Hoffa?
Well, I thought you were going to really mention the most important date in history, which happened 3 days ago when yours truly got a hole-in-one for the first time in his life at Vanderview Golf Course, this wonderful little golf course in Alfred. But if you want to talk history, we can talk history. The issue that you're raising, having to do with Hoffa, has a a little bit of a background to it. There was a Tennessee senator by the name of Estes Kefauver. He was a Democrat. This is back during the middle of the 1950s, around 1957, who went on a campaign against, against organized crime. And he brought in many different kinds of witnesses to his senatorial committee and investigating committee, and among those were a fellow by the name of Beck, James Beck, I think it was his first name, who was the head of the Teamsters at that time. Beck was eventually ousted, at least in part, because of his own connections to organized crime, and as a matter of fact, Kefauver was able to make this into a campaign issue for himself. As a matter of fact, it started a little before 57. He sought the Democratic nomination as vice president in 1956 as a result of the notoriety that he had received. But in either case, the issue of organized crime remained a very, very salient one, a very, very popular one for the next 5 or 6 years. When John Kennedy became president in 1961, he appointed his brother, Robert Kennedy, to become the head of the Justice Department, to become the Attorney General, and Robert Kennedy continued exactly this kind of campaign. By this time, of course, it was no longer Beck who was in charge of the Teamsters. Now it was Jimmy Hoffa. And Jimmy Hoffa did have connections to organized crime. When, a few years later, he disappeared, that itself, of course, remained a national story. It remained the subject of all kinds of theories, as you mentioned a moment ago, not the least of which is that he was ground up, and eventually, his body, or what was left of it, became part of the cement that was used to repair Yankee Stadium during the 1970s. We don't know, but what we do know, of course, is that, there was a kind of national mania. Every so often we become really interested in one issue, and for a period during the 50s, for a short period during the 60s, and again during the 70s, it was organized crime.
Yes, and you can see those hearings either on YouTube or the History Channel's TV channel, and those hearings with RFK and Hoffa. Very interesting political theater. Another point that they make in the This Day in History on the History Channel's website is today marked the death of a senator, Senate Majority Leader Robert Taft of Ohio, dies of cancer at age 63. Now, the History Channel writes him up as a big critic of President Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal programs, and it says that during World War II, Senator Robert Taft warned against the growth of presidential powers. Dr. Ostrower, I want to stop on that point. Did Taft have a point there? Did the presidency become more powerful during President Roosevelt's term and because of World War II? What are your thoughts on that criticism by Taft of Roosevelt?
I'll deal with the criticism in just a moment, but I just want to say something about Taft. Taft was the son of an earlier president of the United States. That's William Howard Taft. And after he was president, William Howard Taft defeated, when he ran against Woodrow Wilson in 1912, Taft eventually would become a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the 1920s. He was a very conservative guy. He had a great deal of integrity. He came from an Ohio lawyer family. They represented corporations for the most part. He was highly respected. His son, Robert Taft, who we're talking about now, was equally respected. He was, in some ways, the leading conservative in the Congress during the late 30s and into the 1940s. He would eventually come with the name Mr. Republican. He ran for the Republican nomination in 1952. He ran against Dwight Eisenhower. He lost because, in part, Eisenhower, after World War II, was kind of a national hero. But Taft remained a very, very important leader within the context of the conservative movement during that period. Now, his comments about growth of presidential power were absolutely on target. The United States government has grown, and it has continued to grow from 1789 until today, and in part that growth was really stimulated, perhaps most importantly, by the Northern victory in the Civil War, the end of whatever states' rights campaign there had been to preserve slavery, and then even more so by the growth of these huge corporations which could only be controlled by a strong national government because these corporations were they existed in many, many different states, so no single state government could control these corporations. And if you're looking for national leadership against corporations, you got to look to the President of the United States. And it was Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt, who provided that kind of a leadership. So we're going to see a rather strong growth, a rather rapid growth in the power of the presidency under Teddy Roosevelt, and then it continues under Woodrow Wilson just a few years later when the U.S. entered the First World War, because the First World War necessitated, at least from Wilson's perspective, the coordination of the American financial industry and the transportation industry and the manufacturing sector of the economy. And then, of course, the New Deal is further going to produce the growth of presidential power. So we have what's called, during these earlier years of the 20th century, the growth of what one historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., called the imperial presidency. The Second World War is going to continue that process. Robert Taft is going to be a critic, but not very many people are going to listen to Robert Taft. Roosevelt, of course, was very popular, and especially popular in respect to his leadership of the U.S. during the war. And Harry Truman, who followed Roosevelt in 1945, will continue that very process. Nixon is going to continue that process. Johnson, Lyndon Johnson is going to continue that process. So you really have the growth of national federal power as well as executive power over the course of the entire 20th century. And while President Reagan argued that, well, we really have to, reduce the size of the federal government, in fact, the United States government employed more people at the end of Reagan's administration than it did at the beginning of the administration. When I say more people, not in uniform, that is to say in the civilian sector of the American government. I don't want to say this was inevitable, but it was certainly an important characteristic of 20th century American life.
We're talking live this morning with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're going to continue our history discussion when we get back. That's right after the forecast.
It's the summer clearance event at Maple City Dodge. 2018 Jeep Compass Latitude 4x4, only $189 a month. $189 a month. A 2018 Dodge Journey Crossroad, all-wheel drive, only $219 a month. $219 a month. 24-month leases on both, $2,999 due at signing. Some restrictions and fees may apply. See a Dodge Boy for details. Check out the 2018 Jeep Renegade Limited 4x4 with up to $4,500 cash allowance. This month only. Some restrictions apply. See a Dodge Boy for details. Hurry in to Maple City Dodge Hornell.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn.
Brian O'Neill keeping an eye on a lot of moisture working its way towards the southern tier. Satellite photos this morning showing a lot of cloudiness coming up into the area from the south and west. There's a little bit of sunshine right now across parts of Chautauqua County to our west, but I think that's just short-lived. It looks like maybe around Buffalo, Jamestown, they get a little bit of sun. But elsewhere, it looks like we're in the path of the cloudiness. And those clouds eventually will be producing some showers and thunderstorms. Latest radar right now showing precipitation blossoming across the Ohio River Valley. And we think that's going to track up our way later today. So as the day goes on, we'll see an increased risk for showers and storms. Sunrise this morning was 6:03. It'll set tonight at 8:30. Temperatures today should get to about 75. Showers, thunderstorms tonight, muggy and warm. Nighttime lows 65 to 70. The showers and thunderstorms, they'll continue to come up from the south tomorrow. Temperatures 75 to 80. Chance for showers and thunderstorms tomorrow night, 60 to 65. We'll turn partly sunny Thursday. It's warm and humid with the chance of some showers and storms. Highs Thursday around 80. And we'll stay partly sunny, warm and humid right into the upcoming weekend, Brian.
Glad to have on the line with us Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. In the last segment, we talked about a number of things, including President Taft and his son, Senator Taft. Dr. Ostrower, if I could pick your brain here on a couple of other father-son political leaders. Governor Huey Long of Louisiana and his son, Senator Russell Long. Starting out with Huey Long, who, for somebody who was around in the late 20s, early 30s, is still the topic in all the occasional movie and TV show. Well,
Brian, if you don't mind, I want to just divert in one little way, but in a historical fashion, from talking about Huey Long, who, by the way, was called by Franklin Roosevelt one of the two most dangerous men in America. He was really a kind of, some people considered him fascist. I think there's good reason to think that he had fascist tendencies, authoritarian tendencies. Not all that different, I dare say, from a somewhat more recent president, but we'll get into that in another program. But I wanted to say something, if you will, about the issue of presidential power as it goes all the way back to the beginning of the country. Because it was in 1787 that the United States Constitution was drafted and then ratified over in 1787 and 1788, creating, of course, a stronger federal government with a stronger executive than you had previously had. Following the Revolution, the governing document in this country was called the Articles of Confederation. There was no executive, literally no executive at all, because the men who wrote that Articles of Confederation feared that an executive might become another King George III. So they had a very weak central government and no executive at all. And what happens over the course of the next 12 years or so is that the country's in some difficulty. We don't have an effective foreign policy in respect to Britain, in respect to Spain, and so forth. And consequently, there were demands for reform about exactly this issue, namely creating a stronger government and creating an executive. And when the Constitution was written in 1787, when it was drafted, of course, we created a separation of powers, but nevertheless a much more defined, well-defined executive than we had before. Now, there were two men who I think were of great importance in terms of those early debates. One of them was John Adams, who, without Adams, I don't think there would have been a Declaration of Independence in the first place. And the other was Thomas Jefferson, who, after all, actually drafted the Declaration of Independence. These guys were friends. They were colleagues. They had worked together for a long time. They were both, of course, revolutionaries. But by 1787, they were beginning to move in very different directions. Jefferson was fearful of a strong government. He was fearful of a strong executive. Adams, exactly the opposite. Adams had spent a few years in England, where he came increasingly to admire the English political system with its king. And consequently, when Washington became president in 1789, Adams would argue that not only do we need a strong executive, number one, that strong executive should not be subject to a periodic vote. In other words, he should be an executive for life. Number two, he should have a title similar to the European monarchs. Adams wanted to call him Your Excellency or Your Highness. At one point, they suggested, all right, Mr. President, the protector of American liberties, and so forth. Eventually, of course, it was just shortened to Mr. President. But he wanted a title to kind of elevate the importance of the office. And by the same token, Adams himself, who would become George Washington's vice president, when he served as president of the Senate, he was at the Senate every single day that the Senate was in session, which is no longer the case today. And not only was at the Senate, but when he would go to the Senate, he would be driven by a team of horses, 6 horses, decked out in kind of royal-style paraphernalia. He himself wore a wig. He really, in a sense, wanted to recreate what would be effectively a kind of monarch for the United States. So when we talk about the fear of executive power, I think we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic and take a look at that competition, so to speak, between Adams on one hand and Jefferson, who was much, much more skeptical of executive power, really much more of a small d Democrat.
Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower this morning. Do you have a couple minutes to talk about Russell and Huey Long quickly?
Sure. Well, I don't know a lot about Russell Long. I know a little bit more about Huey Long.
Huey Long is a fascinating political character. There was a John Goodman movie, I think, that came out in the 1990s about him called The Kingfish, which was the nickname of Governor Huey Long. I don't know too much about Russell Long myself, except that he was a Louisiana senator. Doing a Google search on him in the New York Times, it says that President Kennedy, when he proposed a major tax reduction to stimulate the economy, chose Senator Long, who was then the U.S. Senate Finance Committee's vice chairman, to manage this legislation on the floor of the Senate. and long had a lot of success in doing that for JFK. Any thoughts on JFK's tax policies, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, JFK's tax policies were, I think, of great importance in the sense that he begins the process, the Democratic president begins the process of lowering taxes in the U.S. When JFK became president in 1961, the highest level of tax, the highest tax bracket was approximately 90%. No one ever paid it, of course, because, wealthy people would get attorneys and so forth who would, accountants who in one way or another would find loopholes. But nevertheless, what Kennedy argued was that we could stimulate the economy during a recession if we lowered taxes. Well, there was a recession in 1961, again in 1962, and Kennedy got Congress to lower taxes, and it certainly did help. It was a stimulus. Whether that kind of stimulus is important when we are already at very, very high employment, low unemployment rate, that's something else. And, of course, you pay a price for that, which is called a greater deficit. So, for instance, with President Trump's tax reduction package just this past year, we see what? We see an increase in our deficit by $1.3 trillion. That's with a T. $1.3 trillion over 10 years. And I think that, many observers, including conservatives, including liberals, are going to argue that that's very, very dangerous. Eventually, that's going to weaken rather than strengthen the American economy. It's not going to make America great again. It's going to make America weaker than it had been before. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that the process of lowering taxes really begins with President Kennedy. One didn't have to deal with that sort of a thing during the 19th century because there was no income tax during the 19th century. When there finally was an income tax for a short period of time during the 1890s, it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But an amendment to the Constitution in 1912 or 1913, I can't remember the exact year, is going to make it constitutional to pass an income tax, and of course we're all dealing with that for the next 100 years or so.
Well, we are out of time, which is always too bad when we're talking to Hoffa University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. We always learn a lot. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.